University of Georgia, but what do you remember about the movement lawyers? Did any of the attorneys from Atlanta have anything to do with you and your story?
Well, there were movement lawyers and there were movement activists. I mentioned Carl Holman, Jesse Hill Jr., who was at the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, was critical. They were men who belonged to an organization of men called ACA, the Atlanta Committee for Cooperative Action. And they had come together and formed that organization, let's see, 54, 55, 6, 7, 8, about 5 years, in 1959, several years after the 54 decision, because nothing had happened that would test that law to end segregation. So they were looking for various ways, which is how Hamilton and I got involved in applying to the University of Georgia. But they used a lot of the same lawyers who were dedicated to eradicating the separate and unequal existence here in Atlanta. And so Donald Hollowell was one of those lawyers who was my lawyer as well. And Vernon Jordan was a young lawyer who had just gotten out of law school. And so he was working in Don Hollowell's office, not as a full-fledged lawyer, but, working towards becoming one. And so there were people like that who not only took on our case or the cases of the students in Atlanta. I mean, that was a huge responsibility because they were getting arrested every day. And then there came a time when not only did they get arrested, but they would say jail without bail. Now that got turned around at a certain point because I think some of the older people, the parents, didn't necessarily want their children spending endless days and nights in jail. So they came to a resolution of the issue of the separate and unequal facilities in Atlanta that eventually worked itself out. But at that point, for example, I remember Carolyn Long Banks. She was Carolyn Long then, and she was arrested along with Martin Luther King. It was his first demonstration with the students. And I think they were picketing Rich's department store. And so they go to jail. And as I said, the adults made some deal with the power structure. And the students, against their will, were ordered to leave the jail. And Carolyn refused to go. And she said, "Where's Martin?" And she said, "If he goes, I'll go, but if he doesn't go, I'm not going." And so they went, that's when they separated the men from the women in prison. So they went and got him, and he came over, and she said, "Are you going? Are you for this?" And he said, "Yes." And so she said, "Okay, if you're going, I'll go." So he walked her to the door. And as they got to the door and opened the door, he pushed her out and stayed behind because that was the deal. They could go, but he had to stay. And, I'm telling you this because Carolyn shared this with me, but I've also confirmed it with Andrew Young, who told me that when Dr. King was then taken out of that jail here in Atlanta to one of the worst jails in the state, Reedsville. And Andy told me that Dr. King said it was one of the worst things that ever happened to him in his life because they put him in the back of the police car with a police dog that just stared at him the whole trip to Reedsville. It's many, many miles from here. I forget how many miles. But it was a horrendous time. And I think that people, they know he was in Birmingham because he wrote letter from a Birmingham jail and everything. But, those were times that we don't talk about enough because we need to appreciate the sacrifices that people went through. So the students, again, there was a deal made, and eventually the same thing happened in Nashville and other places. There were, but there were resolutions, and in the first instance, some of them represented compromises, but ultimately they resulted in what the students were after, which was full equality and justice. But in the meantime, calling attention to what was wrong in the system, and probably educating people to what was wrong. I mean, that was one of the strengths, I think, of the Atlanta Inquirer. It was unabashedly supportive of the students, but as I said, Time Magazine said it was educating newspapers all over the South about how you cover these things, and you don't cover them by not covering them.
When we start there, right?
Right.
Get in there. Let's see, I'm just gonna mention also, you mentioned like parties. Were there any specific locations? Was it all at like the Atlanta Inquirer building, or?
What?
Were there parties? You said?
Oh, there were parties, the parties that we had, and it's interesting because there were many adults who supported us. My mother was one, Althea Hunter. Carolyn's parents supported us. And the parties, the students would go through these horrendous times during the sit-ins and so forth, and being in jail. But, there were ways that the students in particular made up for some of that torment, as it were, on the weekends. They go to parties at different people's houses, and often the adults, some of our parents, would come to the parties. Now, they may be off in the room, sipping a little, whatever they were sipping, and we didn't drink in those days, not that I remember, but, we would be off in another room dancing. And when I think about Julian, as serious an editor as he was a poet too. And he would write serious poems. But I remember there was one time we had this party, and Julian wrote this little poem, and we did it together a couple of summers ago on Martha's Vineyard. He came to speak. And I said, Julian, you remember at the party you wrote, after one of the parties you wrote this poem? And I started it. And I would start the line, I'd say, see that girl? And he'd look at me and he'd say, shake that thing. And I'd say, we can't all be. And he'd say, Martin Luther King. And so I think that when we share stories of the struggles and sacrifice that our young people went through in those days, this was the kind of thing that also helped us keep on keeping on, that we would relax, and we'd relax together and support one another. And often, as I said, our parents would join us. Often they didn't. But, romances were formed during those periods, and good friendships that go on forever were formed during those periods. And so it was a serious movement and a serious time, but people were, in the end, human beings who enjoyed, and that's the point that they kept trying to make. We're just like everybody else, we live and breathe. We are living, breathing human beings, and we're entitled to all the rights and privileges of living, breathing human beings. So, but in that context, despite the seriousness of the demonstrations and protests and my own case at UGA, we had fun.
Come on. And so tell me about, that's good for sharing. I haven't heard that perspective on a lot of things.
Really?
So so I think that's very good and important to share. You talked about like your case, for example, and I'm good.
I'm
based on
fine.
what you shared. Tell me just a little bit, I guess, about how the case started, and maybe the movement lawyers and their involvement in your case at UGA. And what happened there.
Yeah. When Hamilton Holmes and I were seniors at Turner High School, which was the high school to attend in those days, one day we were summoned by the principal, and we were both leaders in school. I was editor of the paper, The Green Light, and president of the Honor Society, and Hamilton was he was a valedictorian in a class of, I think, 156. He was captain of the football team. And so we were summoned as we often were, to the principal's office to do something. We didn't know what was involved. And it turns out it was Carl Holman and Jesse Hill who were interested in finding a couple of squeaky clean students, I think they called them, because to try and challenge the separate but equal at one of the Atlanta colleges. Because again, this was 1959, and the Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation had been 1954. So the principal called us in and explained why the men were there and asked us if we would be interested, because the reason they had gone down into the high school was it had a young woman who had applied to an Atlanta college, I think it was Georgia State. But the state, which was determined not to desegregate, found they were smart enough legally not to say they were turning us down, anybody down, because they were African American. The young person that they had selected had a child out of wedlock. Now, it may seem funny nowadays that this would disqualify you from going to college, but they used that, and rather than spend a lot of time and money pursuing that case, they said, okay, we're going to go down to the high school level. So we were the two squeaky clean kids. I'm not sure we even thought too much about it when we said yes, because I don't know why we didn't, but we said okay. And so we came down to Georgia State, and with us that day was Carl Holman and Jesse Hill. And this is interesting to me because it's how we were raised. Our parents couldn't give us first-class citizenship because they didn't have it themselves. But they and our teachers at schools like Turner and Booker T. Washington and Howard, they gave us a first-class sense of ourselves. So we were pretty hardy in that regard. So we came down to Georgia State, and both Hamilton and I looked at the curriculum. He wanted to be a doctor, and I wanted to be a journalist. And we both looked at each other and said, this doesn't offer what we want. And the adults were shocked, because here they had their hopes built on us wanting to do this, and we'd agreed to do it. But before they could really get depressed, Hamilton said, well, I think I want to go there, and he pointed north, and everybody knew he meant the University of Georgia. And we were friends, but we were also competitive, and I wasn't about to let Hamp do something that I wasn't going to go along with too, so I said, yeah, let's go. And the adults were frightened because on the one hand, there was still cross burnings here in Atlanta because they were just places where black people were moving into neighborhoods that were all white, had been, and the whites had moved out, but some of them came back and burned places. So if we had gone to Georgia State, there were men in the movement, Atlanta Committee for Cooperative Action, who could pretty much protect us. But Athens was 73 miles away, and they had nobody there. They didn't know a soul. But here were these two squeaky clean kids willing to do it, and that's when they got Donald Hollowell and the NAACP involved. And ultimately, it was Don Hollowell, ultimately it was Donald Hollowell and Vernon Jordan, who was, as I said, a junior member, Horace Ward, who had applied many years before and been turned down and had gone on to study elsewhere, and ultimately Constance Baker Motley, who came from New York, and the Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as it was known then. And so they were our lawyers. And so we applied, I guess it was in May, maybe, of 60. And then December 60, in Athens, there was a week-long trial before a judge, white, Republican. And Constance Motley was the principal lawyer, but Don Hollowell was there. And Vernon Jordan actually discovered during the period when they were gathering material to show the lies, actually, that the state were telling, found they didn't say they were rejecting us because we were black. They said it was a character issue with him. They said he went to beatnik parlors or something. It could have been Pascal's restaurant, who knows? But there was no such thing. And in my case, they said there was no room in the dormitory. Well, Vernon found, going down day after day, several days, combing through hundreds of records, found a young woman they referred to as B.B. Dobbs Brumby of the Marietta Brumbies. And she had been accepted within the same time frame and same grades and everything else as me. So that helped open the case for me, and then subsequently for Hamilton too. Not that particular instance, but other things that were presented. So the case was heard for a week in Athens, and that was December. I went back to the school I had enrolled in Michigan, Wayne State. Hamp went back to Morehouse. But in January of 1961, which was a very short period of time after the case had been heard, the judge ordered us admitted. And on January 9th, we entered. And so by that time, the Atlanta student movement had really gained traction. So there was a lot going on all over the state. And the amazing thing about the lawyers is that they not only represented us, because right halfway through our registration, the judge who ordered us in, for some unknown reason I've never understood, granted the state a stay. So the lawyers, Donald Hollowell and Connie Motley, were here in Atlanta because they were pursuing other civil rights cases all over the South, especially in Georgia. And so we went to the home of a black man in Athens, a very brave black man, because he could have had retribution just housing us. But it was just a few hours, and Connie Motley and Don Hollowell went to court and argued that there should be no delay. And Vernon stayed with us in Athens at this gentleman's home. And within a few hours, Judge Boodle had ordered the registration to proceed. So we went and took naps. I took a nap. I don't know what everybody else did. But we got the word that the registration would continue. And the headline in the Atlanta Constitution the following day, because the judge who ordered us in was a judge named Judge Elbert Tuttle. The judge who had ordered us in initially was Judge William Boodle. The judge who heard the stay was Judge Elbert Tuttle. So the next day in the Atlanta Constitution, the headline was Tuttle Boots Boodle. But that enabled us to continue our registration. But, you know,